Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and I'm very excited to be talking to a wonderful expert in the area of beliefs, in the area of advocacy, and how you can start to become much more effective at building belief in yourself. As many of you know, beliefs are my cornerstone. It's something extremely important to me. Belief leadership is something I've been developing for the last number of years. And in this podcast episode, I get to interview a fascinating person that I was lucky enough to meet, a fellow speaker that I met at a mastermind just last year. Heather Hansen is a best-selling author and a keynote speaker. She was a trial attorney for 20 years, and now she combines her experience in the courtroom with her psychology degree and her time as a TV anchor to help audiences across the world build belief and win. So as you can tell, there's a massive amount of parallels. I want to get straight into it. Heather's very impressive. She does incredible work. She's super sharp. She knows so much about the area of psychology and belief and influence and persuasion. So I'm looking forward to learning lots from Heather today and also to try to understand even more ways that we can start to change the beliefs, not just in other people, but in ourselves as well. And so, Heather, you are very, very welcome. Would love to hear a little bit about your background, what you do, Heather, and also how you came to do what you do.
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I love what you do. The overlap is unbelievable. And I know this is going to be such a fun conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a long time. As you mentioned, I majored in psychology in my undergrad and wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with that. And I ended up going to law school. And while I was in law school, and I went to law school at Villanova in Pennsylvania, I started working at a firm where they did defense work. They defended doctors in medical malpractice cases. And I immediately was in love. I loved learning about medicine and doctors, and I thought it was a really interesting area of the law because doctors laid hands on patients. So it was very personal, sort of like divorce law, but not quite as vitriolic. And so I immediately loved it. I loved the opportunity to stand in front of a jury and argue my case and build belief in the jury. And I started trying cases pretty young, almost right after I passed the bar. And for 20 years, that's what I did. I was at the same firm. I became a partner. I got very good at building belief in the jury. And it was really challenging as a defense attorney because everyone on our jury, Owen, was a patient. No one saw the world from a doctor's perspective. I never had a doctor on any of my juries. And it was my job to allow the jury to see things from the doctor's perspective and ideally change the jury's perspective. And I loved that. And I loved teaching the doctors how to do that because ultimately the jury wanted to hear from them and not me. Over time, the aggressive nature of that, the fact that the courtroom is a zero-sum game and someone wins and someone loses. And because of that, it's very intense. And that just became less and less compelling. And what became more and more compelling was the fact that when doctors and nurses and hospital personnel had worked with me through a trial, they found they were better at advocating to their patients outside of the courtroom, that their patients were happier and more compliant and their relationships were better. And all of a sudden, I had this pull to continue to teach people how to advocate, but to widen it to anyone who wanted to learn how to take the skills that I used in the courtroom and apply them outside of the courtroom to advocate for more time, more money, leadership, change, your personal potential. And so I started doing that. I wrote my first book, The Elegant Warrior. That book did well, and a lot of people liked it. It led to some speaking. And now the majority of my time is spent coaching, speaking, and training people on how to use the tools I used in the courtroom to build belief and help people do what you want them to do.
Brilliant. And so with that in mind, one of the things I was just sharing with you before we started the interview was I used to love the TV show Boston Legal and Denny Crane and Alan Shore and whatnot. And in Boston Legal, it was this legal drama, bit of a comedy as well. But at the end of each episode or most episodes, Alan Shore, one of the lawyers played by James Spader, he would stand up in front of the jury and he would do the closing argument. It was very dramatic. He would just create the writers were so good and he delivered it so well, but he would make an impossible situation possible. He would take something that you're going, there's no possible way he can argue for this. There's no way he can change the mind of the jury. And yet time and time again, they were able to write a script whereby they stacked the deck against him from a story structure point of view. It's like right at the end, you're at the mercy of the monster. There's no way back. There's no way you can succeed. There's no way you can do anything. And then he was magnificently able to turn things around. He was able to get to the point where you were thinking to yourself, this is remarkable. that you were able to take this argument, which I thought was dead in the water, and you were able to turn it around like that. Could you share what are the most important things when you did, because obviously this is not like TV, it's not like the movies. Well, could you share from your own perspective, Heather, what are some of the things that you believe are most critical in the work that you did as an attorney, convincing and getting them to see it, let's say in your case, from the doctor's perspective? What are the most important things that you did that made a big difference?
I think the most important thing, and you make a really good point, Owen, the closing argument is your opportunity to do the most persuasion. Unfortunately, in real life, it's such a small part of the trial. And it's also for the jurors, oftentimes, because it's not television, a part of the case where they're least interested. The part of the case that we actually get to make our strongest points is often in asking questions. And so I'll get back to that because the power of questions is really important when we talk about persuading and influencing people's opinions. But the most important thing is understanding the jury's perspective first. So I was never going to change my jury's perspective until I understood how they saw the world and spoke to the way that they saw the world. So it was really important for me, during voir dire, which is the point in time where we get to talk to the jury, the only point in time where we get to talk to the jury, to really try to understand, where did this person come from? What part of Philadelphia are they from? How did they speak? What kind of words do they use? What do they do for a job? Where are they retired? What has been their experience with the medical system? And then speak to that and have the doctors speak to that and have my witnesses speak to that over the course of the trial. Because if you don't speak to your jury's perspective, and everyone has a jury, we all have juries. The jury is a person whose belief you want to influence and change. If you can't speak to their perspective, you're never going to win because you can't change someone's perspective until you understand it. So for me as a trial attorney, it was really figuring out, how do these patients, because it's a jury full of patients, how do they see the world? How do they see this case? How do they see my doctor? And what evidence and stories can I use to change the way that they see those things so that they see it in a way that's consistent with the way I want them to see it?
So when you were doing that, Heather, was that when you were like picking the jury? Is that at that moment in time? So it's not just you're ruling people out and going, okay, we don't jury number, whatever, but it's also that you were picking up all of the bits of information so you can go, okay, pack that away. And again, what I love about that is that's also going to be something that is relevant to every single persuasive effort. So you're trying to build belief with anyone. Step one, as you pointed out, is really understanding the other person's perspective. Because in order for me to give you directions to the Empire State Building, I need to know where you are first. And so to understand your thoughts, your beliefs, your objections, your concerns, your emotions, even your political affiliation might be helpful for me to know. Obviously, you're not going to be able to ask that per se, or I'm not sure if you are, but
Well, it's interesting that you say that. It depends on the jurisdiction. So in Philadelphia, which is where I tried most of my cases, we didn't get to go as deep, but I tried some of my cases in New Jersey. In New Jersey, and this is back in the day, and even then, this question wasn't all that telling, but they would ask questions like, do you have any bumper stickers on your car? And if you do, what do they say? Because that used to be a way that people would express their political views or their social views or their cultural views. And those things do influence how you see the world. So yes, it is absolutely every single person listening, Owen, has a jury. It's right now our jury is the listeners. We want them to believe that it's worth their time to keep listening, right? And so your jury is not there to judge you. They're there to listen to the different stories and choose what to believe. And so you want to know your jury. One of the first questions I ask people now when I work with them is, who's your jury? And in any given endeavor, you might have four juries. In my cases, I always had 12 jurors plus two alternates. It was just the way it had to be in my cases. All 12 of those people saw the world a little bit differently, but there were also some consistencies in the way that they saw the world. And if it was a long enough trial, I could speak to each of them individually with certain stories or certain pieces of evidence. But yes, the more that you understand the person who you're trying to influence and persuade, the more you can pick the evidence, the stories, and the way that you share those evidence and stories that's going to be the most compelling.
so with that in mind, I often remember a few years ago, I was looking into political persuasion, and they always looked at two types of general persuasion. One was what they called influencing or persuading people. And this was primarily targeting the people that are on the fence. How do you get a person that's on the fence to go your way? But the second one was mobilizing. So how do you get people that already believe what it is that you believe in? How do you get them to actually go out on the day of the election and actually vote? And in many ways, you're talking about a little bit more like, for example, more central route persuasion or more dual-sided persuasion for people that have to make up their mind. So you're showing them the alternative, you're showing them your perspective, you're explaining the weaknesses of the alternative, the strengths of your own perspective, you're defending the weaknesses of your own. So you're sort of arguing back and forth and helping them get a full, comprehensive exploration of exactly why they should vote for you or why they should vote for your candidate, rather. But then for the mobilized ones, they're already bought in. So it's more about getting them motivated, getting them to feel like they need to do this, creating a bit of urgency, a bit of a lighting a light under their arse to get them to the point where I have to vote. And if you look at that, that was a large part of the work of the recent election back in 2020, is that you never had as many people voting. Could you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, the difference between persuading people that are already there, but they need to be persuaded to take action, and persuading people that are on the fence? And we'll talk later about people that are believing something else, but just in terms of the people on the fence versus people that are already believing but not acting.
Yeah, it's a good point. One of the things that's hard in the courtroom is that we don't know where they are. I always say that I would love to be able to ask my jurors questions or even let them ask questions. In some jurisdictions, they can write down questions. But what we do know is that naturally, most of the jurors are already leaning towards the patient side because they are patients. And there's also a sympathy factor in play. So I always have to go on the assumption that they are not with me from the very beginning. And, you said in your question, you talked about they have to feel a sense of urgency. And you've talked about this before, Owen. It's really activating their emotions and getting their emotions involved. And so motivating them to actually do something. It's interesting because the patient's attorneys, I do quite a bit of speaking to patient's attorneys, and we do continuing legal education things together. The patient's attorneys actually do a lot of conversations and studies and teaching on how to activate the jury's lizard brain because they want the jury to be afraid that this might happen to them as well. Because if the jury is afraid that this might happen to them as well, that if doctors like this are allowed to be out there and that this type of thing is allowed to happen, they're much more likely to find for the patient and much more likely to have a higher verdict in that case. And in fact, it's actually against the legal rules for a plaintiff's attorney to say, you have to stop this from happening and say they're closing because it's so prejudicial, because it so gets the jury sort of activated to do things that go outside of the bounds of what is acceptable and have these huge verdicts. So to get back to answering your question, when you know that people are on your side, then you do want to activate them through emotion to become your advocates, to, in my world, to go into that jury deliberation room and advocate for me when I'm not there. And if you know that there are people on your side, then you want to give them the tools to do that. If you know that there are people on the fence, then you want to speak to that perspective. You don't want to assume that they're on your side. If you start speaking to them as if they agree with you, they find it condescending and they oftentimes turn against you. So you've got to be really careful when you say, if you know they're on your side, and I put that in quotes, you need to be quite sure that the people that you're talking to are actually on your side. Because if you assume that you know what someone's thinking without actually asking them, you really can just make them mad. And that's the last thing that you want to do. So it goes back to that curiosity. When you have the opportunity to talk to your jury and ask them, what are you seeing? What am I missing? How are you feeling? What are you thinking? That's a huge opportunity that we don't have in the courtroom. But once you know where they are, you want to speak to their emotions and allow what you're using to persuade to activate those emotions in an even stronger way.
Couple of sort of follow-up questions on that, and it's in particular relation to the work that you've done before, Heather. So to me, when I think about, let's say you have a malpractice case, so you've got the doctor on one side, you've got the patient on the other. To me, it's a lot easier to generate emotion from a patient perspective, just because everyone can identify with that. It's harder for people to identify with the experts. So I've got sort of a double-parted question. The first one is, what were the kind of emotions that you were looking to build when you were representing the doctors and the medical experts? And then the second follow-up question is, given the skepticism that seems to have become even more prevalent since 2020 or since COVID, the skepticism towards the medical profession, and it's always been there to a degree, but it seems like, at least from the media and social media, it seems to be at an all-time high, but the skepticism towards doctors and whatnot, what are some of the things that you think need to be done more now than ever when you're representing doctors, given that skepticism? So again, What are the emotions that you want the jury to feel for the doctor? And then second of all, what are the adjustments that you would probably be recommending people making if they're doing what you were doing for so many years now in this current climate of skepticism towards medicine?
Oh, and your questions are great. And let's first talk about the emotions. You're so right. And I always say that it's so much harder, in my opinion, to defend doctors because you've got the patient who is allowed to tell the story of where they were born, where they grew up, how much they love their family, the pain that they are in, the jobs that they had, how much they love their job. And then on the defense side, none of that is relevant. So even to speak about the fact that the doctor, for example, goes to the third world countries to do surgery on cleft palates, that might not be relevant. The judge might not even allow that in. So it's very difficult to get to the emotion on the doctor's side. Unfortunately, it's one of those situations where there's two ways to have the tallest building in town. You can either build the tallest building or knock down everyone else's. On the defense side, the emotion that you most often want to activate for the jury is doubt of either the plaintiff, the patient, or the patient's expert, and sometimes allowing that doubt to turn into anger that, it's because the patient brought this case that they're sitting here. And if the case is not founded on true medical reality, then the jury does get angry, not so much at the patient, but at the patient's attorney and at the patient's experts for lying to them and trying to fool them and for thinking that they're not as smart as they actually are. And that is the emotion that I try to activate. Cross examination for me was the most important part of the case. And cross examination, Owen, of the expert, not the patient. There aren't that many female trial attorneys. I think it's less than 5%. And one of the things that my mentor would do when I was young and learning, he always had me cross examine the patients because I was my way is very gentle and compassionate and quiet and not aggressive. And you don't want to be aggressive with an injured patient, even if they're not as injured as they're claiming to be. But you can get quite aggressive with an expert who's telling the jury something, especially if you have, and this is one of the things that I love to do, collecting every single thing this expert ever said before in any deposition, in any case, anytime he was sworn to tell the truth. I would read those for days and just pick out the parts that contradicted what he was going to tell this jury. That would make a jury mad. And that would lead to a very quick verdict on the defense side.
Just on that, because I know we still have the second part of the question, but on that with the expert, so would you also go down the route of challenging, for example, the narrative that is being spun? Like, for example, you can't go after the patient really because that is a no-no in front of the jury and makes them feel like they're being bullied or whatnot. You can go after the expert, fine, and you do that, and that's a great understanding of how you do that. But what about I've heard this again as a strategy or interaction, when the opposing attorney is positioning a certain narrative and trying to convince you of this, how often would you go in and draw attention to what they're trying to do? So draw attention, as opposed to going in and arguing against what they've said, drawing attention to the way in which they're trying to build that story in the jury's mind to make the jury extra aware. Is that something that you would do as well? And how often would that work?
I would do it if I had built my credibility up first, not from the very start. You want to, at the very start, you want to be sure that you're going to get what you're going to get. On the defense side, you're defensive, right? That's one of the things I didn't like about it. It's constantly being on the defense. Like, what's going to happen next? How do I defend against it? But once I've crossed the expert on the other side, if I have obliterated that person, it sounds so aggressive, but if I have really torn down what they're saying and made it clear to the jury that they're not telling the truth, then I can go a little bit more on the offensive. And during my closing, I can point out, here I have my doctor who has dedicated their life to the furtherance of knee surgery and making sure that these risks that cannot be prevented, no matter what anyone does, we know that there are certain risks that just cannot be prevented. But this man has spent his entire life trying to prevent those risks which cannot be prevented. And then the other attorney brought in this expert who's never done anything to increase the literature or the training or the studies about this thing. And he lied to you. So yes, I will go after the attorney and I will go after that expert and not go after the patient themselves. Now, I have seen other people do that. I just don't think it's ever effective. Even when I've had cases where I never get surveillance on patients, other attorneys or insurance companies like to get surveillance on patients to see if patients are really as damaged as they claim to be. I think a jury doesn't like the idea of me sending someone to hide in the bushes and take video of a patient. But even if we have surveillance, one of the co-defendants got surveillance that make it very clear that the patient is not as injured as he or she claims, I still don't go after the patient because one member of the jury might see themselves in that patient. And I don't want to risk that if I can go after the expert who they don't know and they know is a paid and a hired gun and to really attack it. And once I can do that, Owen, to answer your question, then I will go after the other side's case and I will go after the other side's attorney and I will become a little bit more aggressive. But I start on the defense, assuming that the jury hates me and hates my doctor. And then I just work to overcome that by the end of the trial.
And then with regards to back to the second part in terms of nowadays, given the skepticism, what are some of the extra things that you might add into the mix to prepare or handle that?
Listen, it's really hard. I have to be honest with you. So I practice primarily in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is well known as one of the worst venues for doctors. 2 weeks ago, there was a trial that ended in the largest jury verdict in a medical malpractice case in history of Philadelphia. $183 million was the jury verdict in this case. Now, it was a birth injury case, so the child will need a lot of care over the course of the child's life. But it is really hard right now to get a jury, especially in Philadelphia, just because of the makeup of that jury pool, that is able to see the world from a doctor's perspective. So the unfortunate true answer to your question is more cases are settling and more cases are being taken out of the jury system and into an arbitration system where your jury becomes three doctors or three judges or one judge who are deciding the case, who have a little more experience and understand the ins and outs of medical malpractice a little bit more. However, if you do have to go in front of a jury right now and you have a jury that feels a certain way about doctors, you need to really understand that from the beginning, really explore that during voir dire when you meet with the jury and get to explore their opinions on medical providers. And then you just can't hide from it. You've got to speak to it. And the judge has to sort of allow for that to speak to it so that when you put your doctor on the stand, you talk a little bit about what's going on for that doctor, what that doctor's day looks like, what the doctor's day looked like on the day that he treated the patient, and really try as best you can within the confines of what you're allowed to do to personalize the doctor.
That's really, really great. Great answer and very, very helpful in terms of understanding what we can do to deal with challenges like that. Let's bring it into there's a great framework. We talked before about evidence, and you have a great framework that you work with or use with people in terms of evidence. Could you share a little bit about what it is, what it's used for, and give us a sense as to what it looks like?
Yeah, so I'm obsessed with evidence. And for me, evidence is everything, right? In the courtroom, we both sides have our evidence. It's the medical records, it's the medical literature, it's the past depositions that the experts have given. There's tons of evidence. And it's the same evidence for either side. And then it's the lawyer's job to just play with the evidence and take even bad evidence and try to figure out a way to make it good, and take even good evidence and be prepared for a way that it could be made bad. And so once I've decided, the first thing that I want to do is play with the evidence and create stories that use the evidence in the best possible way. And then the framework that I use is that I want to share that evidence with the jury as many ways and as many times as possible. So you are, I'm sure, aware of this, but there used to be a saying that in advertising and marketing that people have to hear something 7 times in order for it even to register. And then the number went up to 9, and now I think it might even be higher than 9. But I stayed with that 9 number. And I said, you have to share the evidence 9 times. But for me to just get in front of a jury and say 9 times that the medical records show X, they would get annoyed with me. They would be bored with me. They would think I'm a moron. And so instead, it's 9 times 9 ways. What are the different ways that I can share the same piece of evidence so that it registers with the jury? Yes. But also, Owen, so it speaks to the different jurors' perspective, because some jurors are visual. Some are audio learners. Some like to see what we call a dog and pony show, where I have the doctor come down and sort of show the tools that they used in a surgery. Some want to see data or a medical chronology or an animation. And so I really try to take the most important evidence. What is 9 ways that I can share that evidence with the jury so that they register it, and so that the different learners, the different perspectives in the jury are all hit with that piece of evidence in a way that impacts them?
So that's great. So let's just dive in a little bit more to examples of that. So I'm presuming, again, just going to throw out some off the top of my head. You could have for example, a story where you leverage that piece of evidence. You can have a scientific research study that was done. You could have a definition which presupposes that piece of evidence as part of it. You could have an anecdote which sort of shares it in a, I suppose, less detailed way that as you would do in a more sort of longer term story. You could have graphs or charts or pictures or photographs. Again, just to start, and you could have the dog and pony show, as you said. Could you just share a little bit more about the different, like, what are some examples of those nine kind of ways that you might use?
And you gave some great examples. So I would do these days animations. It used to be, this shows my age, but it used to be we'd have like a poster board with a picture of the anatomy. And now it's these animations, especially for birth injury cases, animations of the birth canal and what's going on in the birth canal and the baby moving in the birth canal. So an animation is one, a straight picture is another. Having the doctor come down and show the jury what he or she did is another. So that's three. One of my favorites is a nurse. So juries like nurses better than they like doctors because their experience with nurses in general is usually better than it is with doctors. And they also seem to assume that nurses aren't like these highfalutin, making money type of people. So if I can have the nurse come in and testify to the same thing that the doctor has testified to, that's another way of sharing that evidence. I will say it in my opening statement. I'll try to get the expert on the other side to say it. So from different people, if I can get it from the expert on the other side, that's a great way to convey that evidence because it's coming from the other side. Ideally, my favorite thing is to get the judge to say it. Now, the judge is never going to say anything specific, but even if I can, she'll never say, he or she will never say anything specific about the medical records, but she will speak to in her charge, she will speak to aspects of the case. So if I can just use some of the words that I know that the judge is going to use about my evidence, that might click with the jury and they have huge credibility and respect for the judge. So then I'm going to benefit from that credibility and respect. So all of the ways that you talked about, the medical literature for sure, medical definitions for sure, pictures, nurses, texts, if I can get the patient themselves to say the thing, and sometimes you can, sometimes the patient will agree with some of the things that you want to say as part of the evidence. But I really try to be creative and play with the evidence to make sure that I am, especially my very important evidence, the stuff that really proves my case, that I'm giving it to the jury in all of the ways that's going to speak to all of the members of that jury.
Fantastic stuff. Really, really interesting. Just in terms of one of the things I, again, know that you're known for is this notion of advocacy. And I would love you to go in because I love the term. I think we've talked about again, like this is something that I think is so important. And we know about advocates in terms of allies and whatnot. Could you just go in a little bit into describing what you mean by advocacy and what specifically you're doing for people to help them to become better advocates?
So the definition of advocate is to publicly support something. And so right now it's funny because I think a lot of people are thinking of it in terms of advocating in front of Congress or public advocacy. It's not that deep. It is, publicly supporting something. The way that I like to describe it, Owen, is one of the ways I describe it is you're building belief. But ultimately, it is knowing what you want, knowing who can give it to you, asking for it in a way that actually makes them want to give it to you. And so I work with all kinds of people to do that. I work with leaders who want to make change and they want their team to buy into the change. And so they know what they want. They know who can give it to them. How are we going to ask the team, get the team on board with change? I work with salespeople who want to ask for sales. How do we get customers to buy? I work with marketers, same thing. I work with women who want to advocate for themselves and get raises or promotions or opportunities. I work with teams as well that teaching team members, especially in DEI, to advocate for each other. And so all of this is knowing what you want and who can give it to you and asking for it in a way that's actually effective. I talk about your outer jury as the people who can give you what you want, but you also have an inner jury. And I think you'll resonate with this. Have you read the book Chatter by Ethan Kross?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, he talks about the various voices in your head that are all going on at once. And my thought with the inner jury is the part of you that hears all those voices, listens, and chooses what to believe for yourself. And when you have all those negative voices in your head, you want to counter them on purpose with some positive voices, with another stories, with some different evidence. And so your inner jury, the part of you that listens to all those voices and chooses what to believe, that's your first jury. Because if you're a leader advocating for change, but you're a little iffy on the change and not so sure it's going to work, you're not going to be as effective of an advocate as if you are in full belief. Because most of the time, your outer jury rests on your belief. And so you want to be in as full belief as you can be.
Mhm.
And then you go out and advocate for it with others. And I have tools to do that. I have the 3 C's of an advocate, which are compassion, curiosity, and credibility. And then I have the C technique, SEE, which is stories, evidence, and energy. And we can use those no matter who your listener is right now. There is something that they are advocating for this week, and using these tools will make them better at it.
Great. I mean, this is very much in line with the stuff that I do. I mean, just a bit of background on because I love the notion of the inner jury, and that's not a way that I heard about it described before. Years before, actually, the book, because I've been in the field of NLP, I've been talking a lot about internal dialogue and what I call internal multilog, which is that it isn't just you've got the inner critic. And even in my TED talk, I had like the 2 voices, but I've always been talking about the fact that we've actually got tons of voices. We've got, an anxious voice, a worried voice, a stressed voice, a poor me voice. We've got the critic voice, of course. We've got also the positive voices, the motivated voice, the what I call the boss voice. And I always talked about elect a new voice. That was the metaphor I would use from a political standpoint is you need to elect a better voice to speak for you and to recognize that whenever you are speaking to yourself, once you give it a label, once you label the inner voice, you can then start to do stuff about it. So when I read the Cross book, I was like, so much of that was resonating with the kinds of things that I believe really make a difference. But I love the notion of an inner jury. And I just want to dig into a specific application of that I think is particularly important nowadays more than ever. This notion of imposter phenomenon, it's labeled obviously imposter syndrome nowadays, but imposter phenomenon was the original term. And it's this notion in a nutshell. It's when people doubt themselves and think that they'll be found out sooner or later, I'm going to be found out. And I think the research shows, and most people I think would intuitively know that although it happens to all sexes, for women in particular, it is something that becomes an issue. Women, in terms of confidence in business, they will struggle more on average than a lot of men. And the whole example that's thrown around all the time is women will go for a job, men will go for a job if they've 60% of the qualifications or so, 60 or 70%. Women will go for a promotion if they've got 110% of the qualifications, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this notion, I know it myself, I have a lot of my female colleagues that will doubt themselves a lot more and be a lot harsher on themselves than men will. Could you share what are some of the things that you do when you're teaching women in particular to advocate for themselves? For anyone listening out there, because in my experience, honestly, I'm not just saying this, but the women that I've met in the positions I've met them in are so much sharper and smarter and more competent than a lot of the men. I'm not saying it's universally true for everyone, but I know that there's so many women that are not showing their brilliance because they're too busy inside their head, limiting themselves in that way. And I'm also not saying for anyone out there that's listening, oh, you're saying there's no discrimination. I'm not even talking about that. There's obviously societal factors and organizational systems in place that make it harder. But I'm saying there is a lot of women out there that aren't being as bright as they can be. They're not shining their brightness as much. Are there any things, first of all, would you agree? And second of all, if you do, are there any particular things that you found useful? Because you're in a position where you're also a great role model. You demonstrate massive amounts of confidence. You demonstrate self-belief. So you're great as for example, even an informal mentor for women to look at and go, there's the demonstration of someone who is able to communicate very confidently and to take no shit, quite frankly. From your perspective, is there some advice that you would have or some things that you think are particularly important for women?
Well, I appreciate your compliment there, Owen, but I have imposter syndrome, same as everyone. I hate the term. I hate the term. I'm really into words. I think words have power, and the root of the word imposter is it comes down to liar. And I just don't think we're lying when we want to do these things that seem outside of our reach. I would prefer aspirational syndrome, right? But in any event, it is a thing, and it is a thing that people feel. And it is a thing, you're right. Women, and especially Asian women, tend to have it at the highest rates. I coach a lot of women one-on-one, and we coach on this quite a bit. And the women that I coach are very, very successful. In fact, I have a group tonight and I have a super successful lawyer, a super successful doctor, and they struggle with this as well. What I encourage them to do, go back to our inner jury, right? It's our inner jury who is listening to this voice that says you're not good enough. They're going to figure it out. They're going to see that you aren't as good as they think you are. You're going to be found out. There's all those voices. And you're right. It's not just one, it's a host of voices. So we just have to give the positive attorney or the team of positive attorneys something to respond with. And that is evidence and stories. So when I start coaching with someone, I send them a journal that will say Sarah's evidence journal on the front. And I encourage them every day to write down 3 things that happened that day that can be evidence of something good and what it's evidence of. And it doesn't have to be complicated, Owen. So it could be something like today I figured out I was on a different podcast and I figured out a new software that the podcast host was using. And it was frustrating for me at first, and I'm not great with tech. And then I figured it out. So I would go home tonight and I would write down the scenario that happened. And then what is it evidence of? It's evidence of the fact that I can figure out technology even when it's completely new to me. It's evidence that I can be more patient than I thought I could be. It's evidence that I can figure things out if given a little bit of time and a little bit of space. If I have a mother who's returning to the workforce after having been out for a while and she says, Heather, I have no evidence that I can do this job. We'll talk about the things that she's been doing at home. Have you broken up fights between your kids? That's evidence that you're good at conflict management. And I'm not kidding around here. It's playing with the evidence. If you had to be the attorney for the case that you are the perfect person for this job and that you're not an imposter and that you have everything you need, how would you argue it? I didn't get to pick my cases, Owen. I was assigned my clients. And so I had to take the evidence in the story and find a way to make it work. And that's what you have to do. And so often, once you do that, most of my clients, most of the time, agree that they would rather be making the case that they're not an imposter than that they are. Because once they look at the evidence and they look at the story, it's pretty clear that there's plenty for them to play with and plenty for them to persuade their inner jury to believe.
Well, I love that. And I think that's a great metaphor, a great way to turn it around. I know there's a lot of psychological insights from the area of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, such as cognitive appraisal and kind of restructuring, which is very much aligned. But I really love the whole, approach to it from an evidence and jury perspective. I think it makes it even more human. Sometimes a lot of the psychological terms can make it a little bit sort of difficult to grasp or difficult to go in. Just for what it's worth, for me, when I talk about imposter syndrome, and again, generally speaking, it was known as a phenomenon, then it became syndrome because psychologists have to make sure that everything is wrong with you.
Yeah.
That's our remit sometimes. But with the whole notion, it's like, first of all, people will sometimes interchange the term fake it till you make it and act as if. And I always try to, again, like you with language, Heather, I always draw a distinction and go, no, there's a big difference between fake it till you make it and act as if. Fake it till you make it implies that you're faking it. And then you hope at some point you're going to make it. Whereas acting as if is exactly what we did whenever you were a child and you were learning to walk, you didn't fake, I'm going to fake walking. You know what I mean? You acted
Yes,
as if until you got to that stage.
that's right.
And when people start to see that, they again change their perspective of an imposter. The other way I go about it as well is that we're all imposters. Everyone is guessing. If you think that person who looks absolutely convinced about something knows what they're doing, all you have to do is look at politics in the world the last 8 years or so. And what you'll notice is there's all of these people that are heads of countries, and you're asking yourself the question, how did someone get such an amount of power given what we know about their decision making, the way in which they think? And I'm not pointing fingers at anyone in particular, but I'm just saying there's so much evidence out there that all of these people that we thought knew it all really don't. Everyone is guessing. And so when you realize that everybody's an imposter, then you realize, well, then nobody's an imposter if everyone is. And the other thing that I also do is, again, similar to your approach, it's like, what is the fact that you feel imposter syndrome evidence of? It's evidence that you're actually one of the few people that is self-aware enough to know that you need to keep improving and getting better. Whereas the people that don't experience any sort of imposter phenomenon, well, they're the ones that probably need to a bit because they're the ones that have like the Dunning-Kruger stuff going on, which is debated itself, but it's still this notion that I believe that I'm great at this. Well, if you believe you're great at something too much, you might be ignoring all of the evidence that suggests that actually you don't know as much as you think. And so the people that tend to think of themselves as the smartest are actually the ones that are the other side. So I absolutely love that. I want to finish off with just before, because I'm very mindful of your time, but I'm definitely going to be asking you to come back because I've still got 7 million more questions in my head. But I love to do a lightning round with everyone, and I'm particularly interested in your answers to these. So I'd love to start off with a favorite movie of yours, Heather, and why.
I have a lot of favorite movies, but one of my favorites is A Few Good Men. I love the courtroom scenes in that movie are absolutely phenomenal. I also happen to be, I went to undergrad in DC, and that's where they filmed that movie. So
Oh,
I went to watch them film it, and I met Tom Cruise. I mean, was standing there and chatting with them while they were filming, and Rob Reiner and Demi Moore. And so I have an emotional thing. Jack Nicholson wasn't there that day for that scene, but I have an emotional because I have memories of it. But also, I just love the courtroom scenes. They make me laugh. And as a lawyer, the part where he's like, but I strenuously object, like as if the strenuous part is really putting
yeah.
us over the edge. I enjoyed that movie very much.
Love it. Love it. You can't handle the truth. Fantastic. Favorite TV series?
Gosh, I am not typically a fan of the legal stuff, but I do love Boston Legal. And I loved The Good Wife with Alicia Florrick, who's Juliana Margulies. I loved that series. Right now, I'm obsessed with Ted Lasso. For people who are obsessed with belief, how can you not be obsessed with Ted Lasso? I just obsessed.
Believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Absolutely. I also like the fact that Ted Lasso is introducing a whole new world of soccer to the Americans, and a lot more people are talking and interested in it, which is great. Favorite book?
Oh gosh, I read a lot. So this is a very difficult call. I would say right now, the one that comes to mind is 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough to have him on my podcast, but I'm very aware of time. My clients are very aware of time. It's one of the things that people often want to coach on. They don't think that there's enough time. And I loved his perspective on time in that book. And I also just thought it was beautifully written. So I think that would be one of my current favorites.
Excellent.
I will say, I also read Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead, which I think was just nominated for the Pulitzer Prize.
Oh,
And I enjoyed that. And I do think that fiction can be really good at helping us to see other perspectives and get in that world, stay in the practice of that.
what's the name again? That
Demon
book?
Copperhead.
Demon Copperhead. Okay. Yeah. No, I haven't even heard of it, so I'll definitely check it out. I've read the 4,000 Weeks. Excellent book. Favorite author?
I like Barbara Kingsolver. That's why I read that book. She's the author of Demon Copperhead. BJ Fogg, I like him. I had him on my podcast and he was very kind. I love Marianne Williamson's books. This is not a political statement. I don't want, politics she's running, but I really enjoy her books. She's a student of A Course in Miracles, which is
Mhm.
one of many different spiritual studies that I like to read about. And her books, especially some of her earlier stuff, I really enjoy.
Fantastic. Favorite artist?
Oh my gosh, my mind is blanking. Matisse, who, as he got older, he could no longer hold the paintbrushes because of his arthritis. And
Wow.
so instead, he did the construction paper. Was able to use the scissors and he did the construction paper cuttings. And I love that his artistic style and creativity stayed and it just changed form. I think it's Matisse.
Okay. Fantastic. Favorite musician?
I would say I like Bono. I mean, I like you too, but I really like Bono. I like his approach. Anytime that I've heard him interviewed and he's doing a one-man show, I love his approach. I love Ireland. I'm half Irish. So I think that as far as current day, I also like Neil Diamond. Get those two.
Well, that's great. Look, you've got the Irish represented, so I'm happy. Favorite philosopher?
It's difficult because there aren't that many female philosophers, and I always want to go for that. But I will share with you a woman who's current. Her name is Kara Lowenthal. She went to Harvard. She was a lawyer for half a minute, but she is now a life coach. And I put that in quotes, but she is pretty deep in philosophy. And she makes the argument, she's a feminist life coach. And she makes the argument that self-help is philosophy, especially the way that she teaches it. But because it's primarily a female endeavor, it's often seen as less than the philosophers. So I think that if your listeners are like, well, I'm not into philosophy or I don't even really know what that means, her podcast really speaks to what philosophy is and even stuff that we're talking about is a form of philosophy, especially if you're interested in feminism. Her podcast is called Unfuck Your Brain.
Okay. Yes, I actually have listened to an episode of it. I didn't realize it was her, though. So that's really good. Great stuff. Just a couple more. Desired superpower?
Oh gosh. Read minds because then I could persuade them like crazy.
I love it. Yeah, very, very much on brand. Again, time travel, anywhere in particular you go, past, present, or future?
I'm also half Norwegian. And so I would like to go back and be a Viking.
Of course. And then if you were doing another, where do you think you'd be and what would you be doing?
I started college thinking I was going to be a journalist. I like telling people's stories. I like the opportunity. I like asking questions. So I think some form of journalism. I mean, it's changed so much these days with streaming, and there's so many journalists out there, and journalism has sort of lost its credibility.
Yeah.
But when I was younger, that's something that was on the list.
And where would you live?
I don't know. I live outside of New York City. I love New York City. It's hard for me to imagine living anywhere else, but I guess if I could be anywhere at all, I'd go to Paris.
Beautiful. And last question, one piece of advice for the world. If you could put it on a billboard, what would it say?
Oh boy. What you see is what you get.
Love it. Heather, how can people find out more about you and get access to your books and listen to your podcast and whatnot?
So the easiest way is just go to my website, advocatetowin.com. There you'll see links to my books and my podcast and what I do and some blogs that I put out and all the good stuff.
Thank you so much, Heather. This has been terrific. Everyone, as you can tell, you will get a lot if you do visit the website, advocatetowin.com, and check out Heather's stuff. Her podcast, excellent. She's got some brilliant guests on it. And it's, as you have already realized, very much worth spending some more time listening to Heather. Brilliant stuff. Definitely going to have her back on if she would be so kind. But for now, thank you so much, Heather. It's been wonderful.
Only if you'll return the favor, Owen. I want to have you on mine as well. But thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
It's a deal. Thank you.